Have you ever witnessed a moment so unfair that it made your chest tighten, as if you were standing right there, powerless to stop it? Picture this: a grand mansion in New York, filled with chandeliers, polished marble floors, and expensive artwork lining the walls. Everything in that house screams wealth and power. Yet hidden in the corners of that glittering palace, a quiet sound emerges. Not the sound of money, not the echo of authority, but the soft humming of a young maid as she cleans. Her name is Maria. She's not wealthy, she doesn't belong to that world of privilege, but she carries something that no one in that house suspects. A gift, fragile, yet extraordinary. Now imagine the man who owns that mansion, Richard, a millionaire whose success has blinded him with arrogance. To him, Maria is invisible, just another servant blending into the background of his fortune. But when her voice dares to rise in a simple melody while she scrubs the floor, his reaction is anything but kind. Instead of listening, instead of appreciating, he bursts out laughing. Not just a chuckle, but a cruel laugh, loud enough for his guests to hear. He mocks her, turning her innocence into a joke, crushing her in front of people who already think she doesn't belong. Have you ever been through this? That sting of being ridiculed for something you never meant to show, something that was simply a part of who you are. What Richard didn't know, what he couldn't even imagine, is that humiliation sometimes has witnesses, and witnesses don't always react the way you expect. Maria's voice, the very thing he ridiculed, was about to take her places he could never reach, no matter how much money he had. But in that moment, in that shining hall filled with luxury and laughter, she lowered her head and kept scrubbing, as if swallowing the shame would make it disappear. The contrast couldn't be sharper. On one side, Richard, with his tailored suit and glass of champagne, certain of his own importance. On the other, Maria, with her simple clothes, her hands rough from endless work, and her heart carrying melodies no one had ever truly heard. This is the clash of worlds: wealth versus poverty, arrogance versus humility, cruelty versus hidden strength. It's the kind of injustice that makes us stop and think, how often do we judge people not by what they carry inside, but by where they stand in society? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. This is not just a story about a maid and a millionaire. It's about how quickly life can turn, how easily a single moment can flip the roles of power, and how the truth about someone's worth often appears when we least expect it. Because behind every act of arrogance lies the risk of being exposed by something greater, something pure, something undeniable. Maria didn't set out to prove anything that night. She wasn't trying to impress or to claim space in a world that didn't see her. All she did was hum, a quiet act, a simple human expression. But sometimes the smallest actions carry the heaviest consequences. And as Richard laughed, others listened. Among the crowd of polished faces and wealthy guests, someone was paying closer attention. Someone who didn't hear just a maid's humming, but a voice that could fill a concert hall. What happens next may leave you speechless, because while Richard believed he had silenced her with humiliation, he had unknowingly opened the door to something far bigger than his pride. And that night, in a way he could never predict, the melody of a humble maid was about to rise above the sound of his cruel laughter. Would you like me to continue by expanding this into the next section of the script, where the unexpected witness hears Maria sing, or do you prefer to first polish and tighten this introduction further before moving on? And maybe this is the part where I want to pause with you for a moment, because stories like Maria's aren't just about what happened inside a mansion in New York. They're reflections of moments many of us have lived in our own ways. Maybe you've been laughed at when you dared to show a part of yourself. Maybe you felt invisible in a room where everyone else seemed louder, richer, or more powerful. If something in this story has already stirred a memory or a feeling inside you, I'd love to hear it. Share it in the comments, not just for me, but for everyone who comes here looking for stories that remind us we're not alone. Your words matter more than you imagine. Every comment builds a space where people can connect, where we can all recognize pieces of ourselves in each other's experiences. And if you've been following along and felt that sting of injustice or that spark of hope, clicking the like button is another way of saying, yes, this story spoke to me. It's simple, but it tells me to keep creating these narratives, to keep bringing you the kind of content that reaches past entertainment and touches something deeper. And of course, if you want to keep walking through stories like this, stories that remind us of the value of humility, of the danger of arrogance, of the beauty that can come from the most unexpected places, then subscribing is the way to stay close. It means you won't miss the next moment when a quiet voice rises above the noise, or when a simple act changes everything. More than numbers or statistics, your presence here is what keeps this channel alive. Together, we create a space where voices like Maria's are heard, where lessons wrapped in emotion reach the people who need them most. So stay with me, because the story doesn't end here. What happened after that moment of laughter? What unfolded when someone truly listened to Maria's voice? That's where everything begins to shift. And it's there, in the silence that followed arrogance, that the unexpected witness stepped forward. The mansion on Fifth Avenue stood like a fortress of pride, its tall windows glittering with the reflection of city lights. Inside, Richard Whitmore moved as if he owned not just the house, but the very air his guests breathed. To him, money wasn't just security. It was power, a shield against humility, a crown that demanded recognition wherever he went. Richard was the kind of man who believed his name alone could open doors, silence voices, and shape destinies. He had built his empire in real estate, turning broken buildings into golden towers. Yet somewhere along the way he had forgotten what it meant to build people. Those around him admired his wealth, but whispered about his arrogance, the way he looked at others as if measuring their worth against the weight of his watch or the brand of their shoes. Maria, on the other hand, lived in an entirely different world, though just a subway ride away. In a cramped apartment in the Bronx, she carried the weight of responsibility on her slender shoulders. Her younger brother Daniel depended on her since their parents had passed away years before. Every morning she tied her hair back, slipped into plain clothes, and moved through the city unnoticed, blending into the rhythm of countless others trying to survive. Cleaning houses was not a dream, but it was a necessity. Yet even in exhaustion, she held on to one thing that made her feel alive: her voice. Singing was her hidden truth, the secret light she carried when the world felt too heavy. Maria didn't have time for stages or spotlights. Her stage was the small kitchen where Daniel did his homework as she stirred a pot of soup, humming melodies that floated like gentle promises. Sometimes Daniel would pause and say, "Maria, when you sing, it feels like everything's okay again." And she would smile, her heart aching with both joy and sadness, because deep down she wondered if her gift would ever matter beyond these walls. Richard had never thought twice about the people who scrubbed his floors. To him, maids, drivers, and waiters were part of the background, necessary but unworthy of attention. He believed respect was something you bought, not something you gave freely. That night, as Maria moved quietly with her bucket and mop, humming without realizing it, Richard's arrogance surfaced like a storm. He leaned against the grand piano, glass of wine in hand, and with a sharp smirk he called out loud enough for the room to hear, "Maria, is that your audition for the next cleaning commercial? Maybe mop in one hand, microphone in the other?" Laughter erupted. His guests joined in, their polished shoes tapping against the marble as if cruelty was just another form of entertainment. Maria froze, her cheeks flushed, her heart hammering. She hadn't even realized she was humming out loud. With her eyes cast downward, she whispered to herself, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" But her voice trailed off, swallowed by the laughter. She wanted to disappear into the floor she was polishing. Richard chuckled again, shaking his head. "Stick to cleaning, Maria. Leave the singing to people who can afford the time." His words weren't just sharp, they were a blade, meant to cut dignity down to nothing, and in that instant, Maria's world shrank. But humiliation has a way of planting seeds. Though she didn't know it yet, those cruel words would echo far beyond the marble halls, because hidden in that room of judgment sat someone who heard differently, not the mockery, not the laughter, but the melody beneath it. Maria's story wasn't one of sudden miracles or easy victories. It was about resilience in silence, about carrying a gift even when no one seemed to notice. Each day she left the mansion after long hours of work, her shoes worn thin, her voice still alive within her chest. On the subway ride home, she would hum softly, almost afraid to let others hear, and Daniel would wait at the window, waving as she returned. He would ask her to sing before bed, and in those moments she felt her heart expand again, as though music was the only place where she was free. "Maria," Daniel once said, lying under the covers while she sang a lullaby, "why don't you sing for other people? You could be on TV or on a big stage. Everyone would love you." She brushed his hair back gently, whispering, "That world isn't for people like me, Daniel. Some dreams don't fit into lives like ours." Yet deep down, she wished he were right. Richard, meanwhile, spent his days wrapped in deals, dinners, and decisions that fed his ego. He believed success was measured in numbers. That influence came from the size of his bank account. His mindset left no room for vulnerability, no room for recognizing value outside of material wealth. But life has a way of shaking even the most unshakable foundations. Behind every polished surface lies the possibility of transformation, even for those who think they're untouchable. Maria's journey, though hidden, was leading her toward revelation. The cruel laugh of a millionaire had tried to silence her. But silence can carry power too, and when her voice found its moment, raw, unfiltered, undeniable, it would show that dignity doesn't need permission, and talent doesn't wait for validation. The night of humiliation was not the end, but the beginning. Richard walked away, certain he had put Maria in her place, never suspecting that his words had created a crack in the armor of his own arrogance. Because when pride mocks what it cannot understand, it often becomes the stage for its own downfall. And, while Maria folded her uniform and laid her head on a pillow stained with exhaustion, somewhere in the city, someone else remembered her voice. Not the laughter. Someone who would soon change everything with a single invitation. The mansion gleamed like a palace, every detail curated to impress. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings carved with intricate molding, their light spilling across polished marble floors that reflected the grandeur of the space. Oil paintings of landscapes Richard had never visited adorned the walls, and sculptures imported from Europe stood like silent guardians of his wealth. Every corner of the house whispered a single message: power lives here. Guests who stepped into Richard Whitmore's home often left with the same impression, that they had been given a glimpse into a life untouchable, a life built on fortunes so vast that ordinary struggles seemed like a distant myth. Richard thrived in this atmosphere. He moved through the halls with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, a man who had spent his life measuring success in square footage and stocks. To him, the mansion wasn't just a home, it was a fortress built to separate him from the ordinary world. The chandelier above the dining room table alone was worth more than Maria would earn in years of work. Yet for Richard, this was simply the backdrop of life. He barely noticed the sparkle anymore. Wealth had dulled his senses, making beauty feel common and people feel replaceable. Maria noticed it all, though not in admiration, but in distance. Every time she pushed a mop across those glossy floors, she felt the weight of inequality pressing against her. She could see the imported rugs, the velvet curtains, the carefully polished silverware, and she knew none of it would ever belong to someone like her. To Richard, these things were possessions. To Maria, they were barriers. But still, she kept her head down, humming softly as she worked, her melodies filling the silence left behind by people too busy to notice her presence. When the evening ended and the laughter of wealthy guests drifted out into the night, Maria's journey home told a very different story. She left the grand entryway, stepping into the cold air of the city, the subway her carriage, the Bronx her kingdom. There were no chandeliers in her apartment, no gilded mirrors or imported rugs. Instead, there were peeling walls, a flickering light bulb in the hallway, and a window that let in the noise of traffic and sirens. Yet within that small apartment, Maria found something money couldn't replicate: warmth. Daniel, her younger brother, would rush to the door whenever he heard her footsteps on the stairs. "Maria, you're home!" His smile was wide, his arms wrapping around her waist, as if she had returned from a journey across the world. She would drop her bag by the door and kneel down, pressing her forehead to his. "I'm here, Danny. Did you finish your homework?" Most nights, dinner was simple: pasta, rice, beans, meals stretched carefully to last the week. But after the plates were cleared, Maria's voice transformed the apartment. She would sit by the window, Daniel leaning against her, and sing softly. Her songs weren't rehearsed. They flowed naturally like water from a hidden spring. Sometimes it was a hymn she remembered from church, other times a lullaby their mother used to sing, and often it was just a melody she invented on the spot. "Maria," Daniel would whisper with sleepy eyes, "your singing makes the apartment feel different, like it's not so small anymore." She would smile, brushing his hair back. "Music has a way of changing spaces, Danny. It can make a palace feel empty, and it can make a small room feel full." These words stayed with her even when she didn't realize it. The truth she carried in her voice wasn't about fame or recognition, it was about transformation. Her gift had the power to shift emotions, to lift Daniel's worries, to give meaning to nights when exhaustion threatened to break her spirit. Yet to the world outside, Maria was invisible, a maid, a cleaner, someone who belonged in the shadows of other people's lives. The contrast between her nights at Richard's mansion and her evenings at home could not have been sharper. In one place, she was mocked for humming while wiping down counters, treated as though her very existence was a disruption. In the other, her songs were the heartbeat of a small family, the thread that stitched hope into the fabric of their daily struggles. Richard's guests raised glasses of champagne under golden chandeliers, while Maria raised her voice under a cracked ceiling. The difference wasn't just wealth, it was perspective. Richard's world celebrated appearances. Maria's world clung to truths unseen by most. Richard believed money gave him the right to judge, to laugh, to decide who mattered. Maria believed music gave her the strength to endure, even if no one else cared. These two mindsets, arrogance versus humility, pride versus quiet resilience, were already on a collision course. Because while Richard flaunted his empire, Maria carried something he could never buy: authenticity. On nights when Daniel drifted to sleep with her voice still lingering in the air, Maria would stare out the window, watching the lights of the city. She often wondered about the decisions that had shaped her life. What if her parents had lived? What if she had been given the chance to study music instead of working long hours? What if her gift was meant for more than these four walls? She didn't know the answers, but she held on to the hidden truth that her journey wasn't finished yet. There was something behind the scenes, something stirring quietly, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And while Richard leaned back in his leather chair, sipping expensive wine and convincing himself he controlled every outcome, he couldn't see what was coming: the impact of that one cruel laugh. Inside, his mansion would ripple far beyond the marble floors. The revelation would not arrive in numbers or contracts, but in a voice that carried more power than his fortune ever could. Maria didn't realize it either, not yet. To her, the mansion was just another job, another paycheck that would keep the lights on and food on the table. But her voice had already begun its quiet journey, reaching ears she never expected. And as she tucked Daniel into bed, whispering, "Good night, Danny. Dream big." The stage of her life was being set in places she could not see. The city outside pulsed with possibility, and somewhere within it, a listener remembered the melody Richard had mocked. That listener's decision would soon shift the course of both their lives, pulling Maria from the shadows of the Bronx into a spotlight she never thought she'd touch, and dragging Richard into a revelation he could never have imagined. The night began with valet lights sweeping across the circular driveway, town cars and black SUVs gliding in like a quiet parade. Inside the mansion, the grand hall radiated the kind of opulence that makes people whisper. A Steinway rested beneath a chandelier the size of a small car, and a gallery wall displayed paintings curated by someone who wanted guests to know that money could purchase taste, or at least the appearance of it. A string trio tuned in the far corner, warming up with scales that ran like silk along the marble. The scent of roasted duck and truffle lingered in the air, wrapped in the perfume of guests who arrived on first-name terms with luxury. Richard Whitmore greeted each arrival like a host accustomed to admiration. He wore a fitted tux, bow tie knotted with surgical precision, a watch that reflected the chandelier's light with every gesture. "Good to see you," he said, the words practiced. He wasn't making conversation so much as confirming his own status in the room he controlled. Maria moved along the perimeter with a dusting cloth and a quiet rhythm, checking glassware, aligning place settings, and picking up the soft footprints left by servants who'd rushed to meet an impossible timeline. She didn't plan to hum out loud. It arrived the way muscle memory does, a fragment of melody from the kitchen that morning when Daniel had asked for a lullaby before school because a nightmare had followed him into daylight. The tune slipped from her without permission as she adjusted a sconce and skimmed the rail of the central staircase, a barely audible thread of sound that wouldn't have survived a single note if anyone had truly been listening for flaws instead of perfection. But some notes don't ask for permission. They find the places where rooms forget to breathe. Maria's voice, even reduced to a hum, carried the kind of color that hints at a hidden truth. There is more here than meets the eye. It drifted past the oil portraits, rose over the polished banister, and curled under the low conversations of power. She was not singing to be heard. She was singing to steady her hands, to organize her thoughts, to calm the part of herself that still burned from last week's laughter. Her mindset tonight was survival. Finish the job, collect the hours, get home to Daniel with enough energy left to ask about his math quiz and heat the leftover soup. The first guests noticed nothing. They were busy mapping influence. Who had landed the new development permit? Who had secured the venture funding? Who had been photographed at the charity gala with a senator? In that crowd, decisions traveled faster than empathy. Then the room's acoustics did what they were designed to do, carry sound clearly, and the hum threaded into the space between a joke and its punchline. Richard was pouring a Bordeaux when he heard it, the sound lighting an old spark of irritation that felt like control asserting itself. He set the bottle down, smile sharpening. The last time she'd hummed in his house, he'd laughed, and the room had followed. The impact had been immediate, a reminder that his guests took their cues from him, that dignity could be reduced to applause lines if the timing was right. He turned toward the staircase where Maria was polishing the newel post. The audience conveniently assembled. The string trio paused. A conversation died mid-sentence. "Maria," he said, voice lifted just enough to command the room. Her shoulders tensed, the cloth stilled in her hand. "This isn't a concert hall. It's a broom." "You're holding." The line landed with surgical cruelty, stolen from his own private repertoire of put-downs. Laughter gathered like a wave and broke across the marble. A woman in emerald silk covered her smile with a napkin. Two men at the bar exchanged looks that said they were relieved not to be the target. Humor is a mask. Tonight, the mask fit everyone but Maria. She didn't defend herself. That kind of confrontation never ends well for the person without power. Instead, she lowered her eyes and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore. the words catching on the edge of embarrassment. She hadn't meant to be seen, hadn't meant to be heard, and yet here she was, center stage against her will. "I was just finishing the railing," she added, as if offering a practical explanation might rewind the moment back into invisibility. But the room had already decided the script. Arrogance amused, humility absorbed the cost. "Then finish it quietly," Richard replied, a smile bright enough to flatter the cameras that weren't there, but always seemed to exist in his imagination. "We're here for dinner, not auditions." He turned away as if he'd closed a file. The trio resumed tuning, a sycophantic soundtrack to a perfectly measured humiliation. In the kitchen, a server gripped a tray a little too tightly and whispered to another, "Why does he do that?" The reply came out as a sigh, "Because he can." Maria swallowed and stepped down one stair, continuing her work with smaller movements, careful to make no sound but the slide of cloth on wood. The sting wasn't new. It was just fresher than she'd planned for tonight. Inside, something braced. A decision not to let her voice die just because someone packed power into his laughter. Beneath the shame, a quieter resolve lifted its head, a reminder that a journey doesn't end in a room that belongs to someone else. "I'm okay," she told herself, words almost inaudible. "Just finish and go home." A waiter brushed past her with a tray of delicate appetizers, each one arranged like a miniature sculpture. The waiter murmured, "You're doing fine," and kept moving. It was a small kindness, the kind that doesn't fix anything but still changes the temperature of a moment. Behind the scenes, people like Maria kept the mansion breathing. They handled the details that made Richard's confidence look effortless, the work that never received a thank you. Tonight, those details were being held together by someone trying not to fall apart. The dining. Room doors opened, candles flickered in glass cylinders, place cards gleamed with gold leaf. A name caught Maria's eye as she passed, Thomas Grant, though she didn't know why it mattered. She lifted the napkin beside his card and adjusted the fork by a fraction, the precise geometry of service drilled into her hands. "One more pass, and you'll be done," she whispered, grounding herself in the ritual of order. Little rituals save people all the time, the ones you repeat until your breathing slows. Guests migrated toward the hall center as Richard announced the evening's theme, a celebration of partnerships and progress, a toast to vision and execution. The language was sleek, the kind that recycles inspiration into branding. He raised his glass, and the room mirrored him. When he finished, people clapped as if success could be measured in decibels. Maria stayed near the staircase, ready to vanish if her presence threatened the illusion of effortlessness she was only ever supposed to be. Visible when something went wrong, but humiliation lingers, and the mind replays moments in loops when the heart is raw. She reached for the banister again, steadying herself with the familiar. The hum returned, not louder, not defiant, just there. A single held note, almost like a prayer without words. She didn't know the dining room doors had opened wider during Richard's toast. She didn't know that the sound traveled farther this time, caught in a current of polished surfaces designed to project music from one end of the hall to the other. She certainly didn't know which ears it would find. Richard did, or rather, he thought he did. It pricked him like a pin in a starched collar. He looked back with the same smile he had used 1,000 times to remind people of their place. "Maria," he said, voice honeyed and hard, "the broom doesn't sing." The joke landed softer on the second pass, but the room obliged with polite laughter anyway. If cruelty is a performance, it relies on an audience agreeing to pretend it's harmless. Maria nodded, an apology forming that never fully reached her lips. She finished wiping the post and stepped away from the stairs, folding the cloth into a tight square as if order could press the chaos out of the moment. Somewhere between the hall and the kitchen corridor, she paused. Her throat felt tight, but not from tears. It was the feeling that arrives when a person stands at the crossing of two roads, continue as the world expects or listen to. The voice that won't stop speaking inside. She didn't sing again. She didn't have to. The note had already done what notes sometimes do. It found someone who knew how to hear. In the forward edge of the crowd, a man who had been quiet during the mockery tilted his head. He wasn't part of Richard's inner circle, but his name carried weight in rooms that measured value differently. He had come tonight not for the Bordeaux or the chandelier or the contracts disguised as toasts, but because invitations like this were the toll booths of his profession. Show up, shake hands, leave early if the music was bad. He set down his glass and listened, eyes narrowing slightly in concentration, the way a person narrows their vision to sharpen sound. Around him, conversations moved on, but one detail had shifted, a barely visible hinge turning. Sometimes the path to transformation begins when a stranger recognizes what power tries to bury. In the kitchen corridor, Maria stood under the fluorescent light and gripped the stainless steel counter. "It's fine," she told herself, a breath chasing the words. "You knew what this was." She ran water over her hands for a second, the shock of cold turning down the volume of her heartbeat. The sous chef glanced over and gave a nod, the universal sign for "I saw what happened." She nodded back, small acknowledgements passing like notes slipped under a door. The hall regained its tempo. Servers moved in a practiced ballet, placing plates that looked like paintings before the seated guests. Richard resumed his orbit, basking in compliments that always sounded the same. If he noticed the quiet man near the front still listening to the ghosts of a note, he gave no sign. Power encourages a specific mindset, that everything meaningful must start from the center of the room. What he couldn't imagine was that the night's real event had already taken place in the margin, in a hum that refused to be erased. Maria took a breath and returned to the edge of the grand hall, posture straightened, face calm, steps measured. The hurt hadn't disappeared, but it had clarified something she didn't yet know how to name. There is a moment in every journey when the map folds differently. You don't see a new road, you feel one under your feet. She resumed the orbit of service, and the room, satisfied with its performance of superiority, prepared for the next course. At the front table, the quiet man lifted his place card, glanced at it, and smiled. To himself, with a recognition that belonged to another world entirely. He leaned toward the woman beside him and said gently, "Did you hear that?" She frowned. "Hear what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he looked past the chandelier's spill of light, past the sheen of marble, toward the staircase where a young woman stood with a folded cloth and a voice she hadn't meant to reveal. And as the trio picked up a soft prelude, he raised a finger, almost imperceptibly, a conductor's habit he couldn't quite switch off, feeling the first stirrings of a decision that would ripple far beyond Richard's perfect table settings. The laughter moved through the grand hall like a choreographed breeze, lifting napkins, tilting bracelets, catching on the edge of champagne flutes. It was the kind of laughter that says more about the room than the joke. Mr. Anderson didn't join it. He had trained his ears for a lifetime to hear the single thread that doesn't belong to the tapestry, the note that drifts in from behind the scenes and tells the hidden truth about what's really happening. He was used to concert halls and rehearsal rooms, to decisions about tempo and tone, to the quiet intensity of a baton poised in the air. Tonight, he had agreed to be here because people in his position agree to these things. The philanthropic dinners, the phone calls that start with "we'd be honored," the expectation that authority will make an appearance and validate the evening. But as the laughter broke and reformed, his attention wasn't on the chandelier or the Bordeaux or the speeches dressed as toasts. It was on the memory of a hum that had slipped past the guard of the room and reached him with the precision of a bow on a single string. He had heard it twice. Not the volume, not the bravado, there was none of that, but the color. Certain voices carry a timbre you cannot teach, a resonance that touches the chest before it reaches the ear. He stood near the front table, the place card reading Mr. Anderson in gold script, and felt a kind of hush inside himself, as if the building had revealed a passage only he could see. Around him, the mindset was social, Names, exchanges, quick alliances. His was craft. Listen, isolate, understand. The decision unfolded not as a dramatic revelation but as a slow recognition. Someone in this room possessed a gift, and the room had just tried to crush it. He watched Maria return to the edge of the staircase, cloth folded with surgical care, movements tuned, to make no sound. She had the posture of someone who wanted the floor to open and swallow her. Yet something about the way she paused, just a breath, just a second, told him that a journey had already begun inside her. He had seen it in young singers before, the moment when humiliation meets grit and forges a new alloy. That's where it starts, he had told students from time to time, his voice low and encouraging in the rehearsal studio. On the day you're told to stop, and you choose how to continue. Now, in a room devoted to the appearance of power, he recognized the truth that often travels in quieter clothes. A server slid a plate in front of him, the duck lacquered, the reduction shining like a small lake under soft light. He didn't lift his fork. A memory arrived. His mother at the kitchen sink in Ohio, singing to the radio while scrubbing pots after church, not because anyone was listening, but because song made work less heavy. He remembered how a neighbor had knocked on the screen door one summer afternoon and asked, shyly, if his mother could sing at the school fundraiser. "I'm not a singer," she'd said, embarrassed. "I just make dinner." He'd watched her say yes, despite that. And somewhere between the front porch and the cafeteria stage, his life had changed direction. Tonight, that same current tugged at him. Not nostalgia, responsibility. The impact of a small invitation can outsize an entire season of programming. A woman across the table touched his sleeve. "Is the trio out of tune?" she whispered, trying to be kind. He smiled. "They're fine," he said. "I'm just listening." He let the words sit in the air like a modest confession and turned his gaze back toward the staircase. The room's architecture did him a favor. The curve of the banister, the hard surfaces, the ceiling height, all of it preserved sound in a way that flattered clarity. He imagined how a single unaccompanied line might carry from that midpoint landing, how it would gather harmonics as it crossed marble and glass, how silence might frame it better than any orchestra could. The conductor in him was already staging the moment, measuring the distance, calculating the risk. Then the person in him, the man who understood what it costs to be humiliated publicly, overrode the professional impulse. This was not about programming a novelty performance. This was about a voice that had been told to be quiet, and the decision to answer that command with an invitation instead of an argument. Richard approached the table, circling like a politician. He was gracious to Mr. Anderson in the specific way people are gracious to those whose opinions might become currency. "You know, we've got a few of your concerts marked on the calendar," Richard said, placing a hand on the chair behind him, as if to suggest familiarity. "The holiday program especially. We take clients every year." Mr. Anderson nodded, polite. "I appreciate your support," he said. Richard leaned in, lowering his voice just enough. "If you ever want to use this hall for a small soiree, donors, intimate event, I can make that happen. Imagine the acoustics under this chandelier." Mr. Anderson glanced up, then back to the staircase, measuring more than acoustics. "I'm imagining," he said, and let the sentence remain unfinished. A quiet refusal to pretend the night was only about transactional generosity. From the corner of his eye, he saw Maria step toward the service corridor again. Timing is an art that thrives on attention. He rose, excused himself with a nod that conveyed the correct proportion of gratitude and necessity, and moved through the tide of guests with the ease of someone who knows how to navigate different tempos. Near the threshold to the kitchen, he slowed, not wanting to spook her into retreat. Up close, he noticed details the room had missed. The red mark near her wrist, where a chemical had irritated the skin, the small rip at the seam of her sleeve, the focus in her eyes that belonged to someone who makes micro-decisions all night long, how to carry weight without dropping, how to move without drawing notice, how to keep breathing when the spotlight arrives uninvited. "I'm sorry to bother you," he began, keeping his tone level, almost conversational. "I'm Benjamin Anderson." She met his gaze briefly, then away again, as if eye contact were a luxury she couldn't afford in uniform. "Yes, sir," she said softly. "Do you need something from the bar?" He shook his head. "No, I heard you earlier." The sentence felt fragile in his mouth because he didn't want to turn her life into a moment that served his curiosity. "I heard your voice." She started to apologize by instinct. "I didn't mean—" He lifted a hand just slightly, not to interrupt her, but to soften the reflex. "You have something rare," he said. "I know you weren't trying to be heard, but I heard you anyway." For a beat, the hum of the building filled the space between them. Dishwashers, muffled, footsteps, silver striking porcelain in the dining room. She studied his face, not for glamour or recognition, but for motive. People like Maria learn to read motive quickly. It's a survival skill, a behind-the-scenes audit of risk. "I'm just here to work," she said, steady now, a boundary set gently but clearly. He nodded. "Of course." He slipped a card from his pocket, the kind that looks too simple to be important. "If you ever want to talk about your singing, no obligations, no promises, just a conversation. Call this number or text. You don't need to decide anything now." She took the card as if it might break, eyes dropping to the raised letters. "The Philharmonic," she whispered before she could stop herself, the name landing like a rumor from a faraway country. "Yes," he said, and let the word carry reassurance instead of grandeur. "My job is listening." She exhaled through her nose, a quick laugh that wasn't humorous so much as disbelieving. "I don't think I'm who you think I she said. "I clean and I go home. My brother's waiting." He smiled, soft at the edges. "Sometimes the person I think I'm hearing is exactly the person standing in front of me." A chef slid past them with a tray, and the moment veered back toward ordinary, but not before the card disappeared into Maria's pocket, small as a secret. "Thank you," she said, the words careful, not submissive. I'll think about it." He inclined his head. "Thinking is good. Decisions made fast can be exciting. Decisions made true have longer lives." She nodded once, and he stepped away, resisting the impulse to look back immediately. In his chest, the conductor's sense of timing and the man's sense of responsibility braided together. The invitation was real, but it would only matter if she chose to use it. A baton can't make a sound without the hands that answer it. He returned to the table as the second course arrived, and Richard intercepted him with an expectant grin. "Now that," Richard said, gesturing broadly to the hall as if he owned the idea of celebration itself, "is how you stage an evening." Mr. Anderson regarded him for a moment and then, with polite sincerity, said, "Staging is important. What happens between the cues is where you find the truth." Richard blinked, unsure whether he'd been complimented. "Well," he said, landing back on familiar ground, "truth is good for press." Mr. Anderson let the comment pass. He had already chosen where to place his attention. In the service corridor, Maria pressed the card between her palms as if its texture could translate into clarity. "This can't be real," she whispered. "Why me?" The question carried equal parts hope and caution. She imagined Daniel at the window, the way his eyes lit up when she sang an old hymn. "If I tell him," she murmured, "he'll think it's a sign." But signs, in her experience, were often bills due on Friday and headaches that didn't ask permission. She tucked the card deeper into her pocket and touched the seam of her sleeve, anchoring herself in the work still ahead. Finish the shift, she told herself. Make one decision at a time. The trio began a waltz, and conversations resumed their careful weaving. Mr. Anderson ate a few bites because eating is part of the social contract, but his mind lived elsewhere, on the staircase, on the timbre that had cut through laughter, on the way a voice can carry the weight of a life without showing the strain. He considered the practicalities. Behind the scenes, Audition procedures, staff schedules, the possibility of a discreet rehearsal room visit after hours, the need to protect her from spectacle while allowing the opportunity to breathe. The orchestra world can be as political as any dining room, and he knew how quickly a good intention could be reduced to gossip if not handled with respect. He would have to make careful choices, the kind that favor integrity over drama. The journey from a hum in a hallway to a stage measured in applause is long and rarely straight, but journeys have beginnings, and this one had just taken a step. A donor at the far end of the table raised a question about commissioning new American works, and Mr. Anderson answered thoughtfully, speaking about impact and community and the way music transforms public spaces. Even as his words flowed, another part of him was still listening backward, replaying the line Maria hadn't meant to sing. He could hear where her vowels placed themselves, how her breath sat low, how the pitch settled without strain. Raw doesn't mean untrained, it means unguarded. That was the revelation. He didn't want to test her, he wanted to meet the source of that unguarded sound in a room where no one laughed. Richard, satisfied that the evening was performing properly, made another circuit. At the edge of the group, he found a cluster of young executives debriefing the joke. "You were brutal," one said admiringly. "Someone has to set standards," Richard replied, a line that had been useful to him in both boardrooms and dining rooms. In his mind, the world arranged itself into two categories, those who enhance the brand and those who don't. He didn't feel cruel, he felt responsible. That is one of arrogance's most polished disguises. Maria passed them, steps measured, eyes on her work. Her pocket felt heavier than anything she was carrying. "Don't drop it," she told herself, and wasn't sure whether she meant the plate or the possibility. When she reached the staircase again, her fingers traced the carved wood automatically, a ritual that had always centered her. This time, the wood felt different, as if it held the echo of the conversation she'd just had. She closed her eyes for half a second and let a breath bloom in her chest. Not a song, not yet, just the shape of one. At the table, Mr. Anderson tapped a rhythm with the pad of his thumb, a private metronome. He imagined how he might phrase the first phone call if she reached out. Where to? Meet, what to say, how to set expectations without shrinking possibility. He rehearsed sentences the way other people rehearse toasts. "There's a room we use for auditions. It's simple, nothing to fear. Bring nothing, no sheet music. I'll bring a pianist if you want one, or we can just listen. You are not a project. You are a person." Each line was less about logistics and more about honoring the space she would be stepping into. A conductor's real job is not to command. It's to create conditions where the music can happen. Another course, another toast. The evening moved forward in precise increments, yet under its choreography a different rhythm gathered. Quiet, insistent, a pulse that didn't belong to the gala. The transformation no one ordered had already begun its work. In one life, a card pressed flat in a pocket now carried a weight beyond paper. In another, a man known for controlling sound, prepared to relinquish control long enough to hear something unplanned. The room remained unaware, fixed on its mirrors and its assurances. When the plates were cleared, a few guests migrated back toward the grand hall to admire the piano. A woman asked if anyone played. A man offered a college memory. Richard, eager to be charming, suggested an impromptu moment. The trio shifted into a gentle accompaniment. Mr. Anderson stayed seated, letting the scene arrange itself without him. He knew that not every stage deserves an entrance. He preferred the small rooms where intentions breathe. From the corridor, Maria watched with the familiar distance of staff, close enough to respond, far enough to disappear. She allowed herself one glance at the card again, then sealed the pocket with a palm, as if setting a promise in place. "Daniel will ask," she thought, and a smile rose before she could resist it. "He'll say, 'Sing for them, Maria.'" She pictured his face, the belief he carried so lightly. "Maybe," she whispered, and the word surprised her with how right it felt on her tongue. The hall's sound swelled and faded, an ornament in search of meaning. Somewhere beneath it, an earlier note kept ringing, inaudible to the room but clear to the few who knew where to listen. The night would continue with coffee and desserts and a final polished speech. People would leave feeling confirmed in their stories about success. Yet the most significant decision had already been set in motion away from the microphone, where humility met authority, and both recognized the other. And as the doors to the terrace opened to the cool New York air, the path ahead took on its first definite shape, asking for the next quiet step. The hall had begun to quiet, though the echo of laughter still clung faintly to the marble walls, like smoke after a candle's flame. Servers moved with practiced precision, removing plates, adjusting glasses, refreshing wine as if the entire evening were part of a script rehearsed dozens of times. The trio played a soft interlude, strings, weaving sound gentle enough to blend into the rhythm of forks and conversation. From where she stood, Maria could almost pretend no one had laughed at her earlier, that her humming had slipped past, unnoticed. Almost. She focused on the work in front of her, folding linen napkins with exact corners, wiping down polished surfaces until they reflected the chandeliers above. Each motion was deliberate, a way to anchor herself in order when her heart felt disordered. Her mindset had always been survival, finish the task, stay invisible, collect the hours. But survival never erases humiliation, it only buries it. And humiliation has a way of resurfacing when least expected. From across the room, Benjamin Anderson watched her. His ears were still tuned to the earlier moment, the hum that had carried through the hall and reached him like a message, not meant for anyone yet impossible to ignore. He had been in countless rooms with polished performances, trained voices, rehearsed crescendos. But something in Maria's sound was different, raw and unpolished, yet truer for it. It carried the weight of a hidden truth, the kind you cannot fabricate, that music lived inside her whether or not anyone gave her permission to let it out. He stood, moving quietly through the crowd, each step deliberate, as though he were approaching a skittish bird he didn't want to scare away. When he reached her, she was bent slightly over the table, straightening cutlery, eyes lowered not out of deference, but out of a habit formed by years of invisibility. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" His voice was calm, steady, not theatrical, but carrying the gravity of someone who had spent his life listening. Maria froze, the question landing heavier than she expected. She turned slightly, meeting his eyes with hesitation, then quickly looking down again. "I didn't learn," she said quietly. "It's just something I do." Richard, who had been nearby entertaining guests with another of his self-satisfied stories, caught the exchange and moved closer. His smile widened with the anticipation of control. "She sings, Mr. Anderson," he interrupted, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But don't let the sound fool you. She's just the maid, a nobody." The words were sharp, designed not only to dismiss, but to strip away any value the compliment might have held. Guests nearby chuckled softly, eager to follow Richard's lead, unwilling to risk his displeasure. Maria's shoulders stiffened. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the silver trays and folded linens, but something inside resisted. Not defiance, not rebellion, just a quiet refusal to fully believe what Richard had said. Mr. Anderson didn't laugh. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying Maria the way one studies a line of music written on the page, knowing it carries more than notes, that beneath the ink there is intention. "A nobody," he repeated softly, as though testing the word on his tongue. "Funny, I've spent my life with voices, and I can tell you with certainty, nobodies don't sound like that." The statement wasn't loud, yet it carried weight, the kind of weight that silences a corner of the room without asking. Maria felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from shame this time, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being defended in front of people who had only ever looked past her. "I wasn't trying to sing," she said nervously, her words rushing out in a low murmur. "I was just finishing my work. I didn't mean to be heard. Mr. Anderson's expression softened, the stern lines of his face bending into something that looked like recognition. The best voices never mean to be heard, he said. That's why they reach people. It's not performance. It's truth. Richard let out a scoff, swirling the wine in his glass as though the conversation amused him. Truth? My dear Anderson, you're being overly generous. She's a maid who hums. Don't mistake accident for art. But the conductor didn't move his gaze from Maria. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his tone to a level only she could hear. Do you sing anywhere else? She shook her head quickly. Only at home. For my brother. He likes it when I sing before bed. Something in her answer struck him with more force than he expected. Not the content, the simplicity of it, but the way she said it, with a humility that revealed music wasn't her ambition. It was her lifeline. The kind of singing that comes from love, not ego. He recognized it instantly because he had seen what ambition alone could do to voices. It hollowed them, made them chase perfection at the expense of soul. Maria's voice, even in a hum, carried soul untouched. I see, he said, his eyes thoughtful, the gears of decision beginning to turn. He could already imagine the possibility, though he kept it close, behind the guarded lines of his expression. Richard, sensing that his attempt at dismissal hadn't landed as intended, straightened his jacket and added in a louder tone, Don't waste your time, Anderson. Talent is for people who can afford it. She should be grateful she even has a job here. The words hung in the air, ugly in their clarity. For a moment, silence pressed against the walls, broken only by the trio's soft background notes. Maria bit her lip, hands tightening around the folded napkin in front of her. She wanted to say something, anything, but the weight of years of invisibility pressed her voice back down. Mr. Anderson, however, did not break the silence. He let it hang just long enough, as though pausing in the middle of a symphony, forcing the audience to lean forward. Then, with the calm certainty of someone who knows authority doesn't need volume, he said, Sometimes the rarest treasures are hidden in the most ordinary places. You'd be surprised what can be found if you're willing to listen. The words weren't just for Richard. They were for Maria, too. She felt them land inside her, quietly but firmly, like the first stone, laid for a bridge she had never thought could exist. She didn't reply, but her eyes lifted just enough to meet his. In that single moment, a shift occurred. Not dramatic, not visible to most of the room, but undeniable to the two people standing there. She returned to her work, hands steadier now, folding linen with the same care, but with a new thought echoing in her mind. Someone had listened, really listened. And though Richard continued entertaining his guests, basking in laughter that felt emptier by the minute, Maria carried in her pocket not just a business card, but the faint outline of a possibility. In the hush between footsteps and whispered conversations, the conductor's gaze lingered on her one more time. He didn't need to say anything further. The seed had already been planted, and seeds, even when buried under arrogance and doubt, know how to grow. And as the music swelled from the trio, blending with the hum of voices and the clinking of glasses, Maria's quiet resolve deepened, ready for the next turn in a journey she hadn't yet chosen but could no longer ignore. The week unfolded like any other for Maria, at least on the surface. Early mornings meant rising before the sun, slipping into her plain uniform and rushing to catch the subway that rattled her awake more than coffee ever could. She cleaned offices downtown, then crossed the city to scrub apartments, all before heading back to Richard's mansion, where the chandeliers demanded constant polishing. To those watching, her life looked like a repetition of tasks with no space for surprises. But beneath that rhythm, something pulsed differently. Something she carried quietly in the pocket of her jacket, Benjamin Anderson's card. At first, she had convinced herself it was nothing more than politeness, a gesture of pity from a man who had felt sorry for her humiliation. She told herself not to give it weight, not to let hope distract her from the bills stacked on the counter at home. Don't be foolish, Maria, she whispered one night, staring at the raised letters of the Philharmonic embossed in gold. "People like you don't get chances like this." She tried to tuck it away, but every time she touched her jacket, the card reminded her it was still there. Daniel, of course, noticed her unease. He had always been quick to read her moods, perhaps because he had learned early how to sense the storms in adults around him. One night, after finishing his homework, he asked, "Why do you keep looking at that card, Maria? Is it something important?" She hesitated, not wanting to plant dreams in him that might never grow. But when his eyes refused to let go of the question, she sighed. "A man gave it to me. He works with the New York Philharmonic." Daniel's face lit up instantly, his small hands gripping the edge of the table. "That's the orchestra you showed me online, the one with the huge hall and all the violins." His excitement made her heart ache. She wanted to protect him from disappointment, but she couldn't erase the truth. "Yes," she admitted softly, "that one." "What did he say to you?" Daniel pressed. "He said—" Maria swallowed, her voice quieter than she intended. "He said he heard me singing, and he thought maybe I could talk to him about it." Daniel's eyes widened, brimming with certainty only children carry. "Then you have to, Maria. They need to hear you." His conviction stunned her. He wasn't asking, he was declaring. She shook her head gently, brushing his hair back. "It's not that simple. People like us don't just walk into places like that. They want singers who've trained their whole lives, people who studied at fancy schools." Daniel's reply was quick and fierce. "But you have something they don't. You sing like Mom used to. You make me feel safe when you sing. Isn't that what music is supposed to do?" His words struck her deeper than any compliment she had ever received. She hugged him tightly, whispering, "Oh, Danny, if only it worked that way." But in her heart, she knew he had touched something she couldn't deny. The following afternoon, while wiping down the marble steps at Richard's mansion, Maria's phone buzzed in her pocket. She almost ignored it, assuming it was a reminder about an overdue bill, but the number was unfamiliar. With trembling fingers, she answered softly, "Hello, Maria?" The voice was calm, warm. She recognized it immediately. "This is Benjamin Anderson. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Her breath caught. She glanced around the hall to make sure no one was listening. "No, sir, I wasn't expecting—" "I don't want to take your time," he interrupted gently. "I just wanted to say this clearly. We'd like to invite you to come by the hall next week. Nothing formal, nothing frightening. Just you, me, and a piano, a private rehearsal. I think you should let your voice be heard where it belongs." Maria gripped the phone tighter. "The Philharmonic?" she whispered, her voice betraying disbelief. "Yes," he said, "the Philharmonic." His tone carried no hesitation, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "If you're willing." For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Fear and hope clashed inside her chest, neither yielding. The thought of stepping onto that stage terrified her. It felt like walking into a world where she didn't belong, a place designed for the rich, the polished, the trained. But the idea of refusing, that felt like silencing a part of herself forever. "I don't know if I can," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "You don't have to know now," he replied gently. "Just come. Try. The rest will reveal itself." When she ended the call, she sat on the edge of the staircase, staring at the chandeliers above. The irony was not lost on her. In this house, her voice was mocked, but somewhere else in the city, it was being invited. She pressed her palms against her face, whispering, "What am I supposed to do?" That night, Daniel was waiting as always, by the window. When she walked in, he ran to her, breathless. "Well, did he call? Did he say something?" Maria hesitated, still carrying the weight of her doubts. But Daniel's expectant face forced her to speak. "He asked me to come to the hall, to sing." Her brother's eyes widened, and he jumped onto the couch, unable to contain his joy. "You're going to do it. You have to, Maria." She shook her head, smiling at his excitement, but weighed down by her fear. "Danny, I don't belong there. Those people, they've studied their whole lives. They know music in ways I can't even imagine." Daniel climbed down and grabbed her hands, holding them tightly. But they don't know you. They don't know how your singing feels. Maria, I believe in you. I always have. And if I believe, maybe that's enough to try." His words echoed long after he fell asleep, his small frame curled under the blanket. Maria sat by the window, the city lights shimmering in the distance, her thoughts tangled. The invitation was more than a chance. It was a test of everything she feared about herself. Could she step into a world built on prestige and still let her voice carry the honesty it held in a cramped apartment? Could she risk failure in front of people who didn't see her worth? She pressed her forehead to the glass, whispering into the night, "What if I'm not enough?" But somewhere underneath the fear, a spark refused to be extinguished. The thought of standing in that hall, of letting her voice echo where only the greats had sung, filled her with equal parts dread and longing. As the city hummed below, Maria realized something. The decision had already begun shaping her, whether she accepted it or not. And with Daniel's words still ringing in her ears, "They need to hear you, Maria." She felt the first flicker of courage ignite, pulling her toward a future she hadn't dared to imagine. The night arrived dressed in winter black, the kind of New York evening that sharpens the breath and makes the streets shine like wet graphite under the lamps. The hall's glass facade glowed from within, drawing people up the steps as if into a cathedral of sound. Inside, ushers guided guests to plush seats, programs whispered open, and the low murmur of anticipation pulsed through the lobby. Backstage, life moved by a different clock. Stagehands speaking in soft code, a piano bench dragged half an inch, a stand light tested with a fingertip, the behind-the-scenes choreography that never shows but always decides how the night will feel. In a small dressing room with a flickering vanity bulb, Maria stood in front of a mirror she barely recognized as hers. She wore a simple dark dress, borrowed from the wardrobe director. Nothing grand, but it fit the space between invisibility and spectacle. Modest, clear, true. She tried to steady her breathing and listened to the faint throb of the orchestra warming up on the other side of the wall. This was the moment when decisions turn into actions, when a mindset either collapses under fear or steadies into courage. Mr. Anderson stepped into the doorway, hands folded loosely, a presence that settled rather than pressed. "How are you feeling?" he asked, voice low. Maria smiled without confidence but with sincerity. "Like I brought the Bronx into a dream I'm not sure is mine." He nodded, the kindness in his eyes making room for both terror and hope. "Good. Keep the Bronx. Keep your streetlight, your kitchen window, your brother at the table. Let the hall come to you. Don't go chasing it." She laughed, a breath more than a sound. "I don't know if I'm ready." He tilted his head. "Readiness is a story we tell to delay our becoming. You're here. That's enough." She pressed her palms together as if to hold the moment still. "If I forget where to put the air," he answered like a conductor and like a friend, "put it where the truth is." Out in the audience, Richard found his seat in the center-left parquet, pleased to be recognized by two donors and a board member before the lights dimmed. He hadn't planned on coming until a colleague insisted the conductor's winter program would be a study in precision. Precision, to Richard, was the metric that separated winners from everyone else. He checked his watch, glanced at the program, and felt an agreeable flush of status just being there. The first half unfolded as expected. Overture, the kind of muscular symphony that makes audiences sit taller, the applause calibrated and confident. Richard clapped with practiced appreciation, already rehearsing a line for later about texture in the brass that he'd heard someone important say once. At intermission, he worked the lobby like a quiet campaign, complimenting a client's tie, nodding at a partner's spouse, and accepting a flute of champagne he didn't need. If his mind wandered at all, it drifted to that night at the mansion when he had cut a maid's humming into silence with a trick of phrasing and a room willing to go along. He felt no remorse. Power learns to file memory under strategy. When the bell chimed, he returned to his seat and checked his phone one last time, sliding it into the pocket of a jacket that cost as much as Maria's rent for 2 months. Backstage, the stage manager knocked twice and opened the door without waiting. 5 minutes, she said with a functional smile. Maria nodded, the words sounding like a spell. She closed her eyes and saw Daniel at the apartment window, his breath fogging the glass in little bursts. "They need to hear you," he had said, and the sentence sat inside her like a small lamp, steady, refusing to go out. She ran her hands down her dress, caught her reflection again, and whispered to the girl in the mirror, "Don't perform, tell the truth." The hidden truth about her voice was never volume, it was color, the way timbre turned emotion into shape, the way breath carried memory without permission. The house lights dimmed to a midnight hush. Mr. Anderson walked on stage to warm applause, authority that didn't need introduction. He acknowledged the orchestra, lifted his baton, and carried the room through a brief piece that acted like a gate. Then he lowered the stick, let the silence linger a heartbeat longer than usual, and stepped to the microphone. "Tonight," he said, the natural authority rinsed free of pomp, "we have a short, unexpected offering. Sometimes a voice finds you when you're not searching. It is my privilege to let you hear what found us." He didn't name her training or pedigree. He didn't sell her as a story. He simply created space and trusted the room to listen. A single spotlight poured onto the stage like milk. Maria stepped into it, careful but not tentative, the way someone enters a place they respect. A murmur moved through the seats, curiosity, doubt, calculation. Richard leaned forward, not with recognition, but with the mild irritation of a donor facing a novelty. He searched the program again, as if it might explain the interruption, and then looked up with the polite skepticism of a man who has paid for excellence and expects it on cue. Maria found the center mark and placed her hands by her sides. In the first breath, the hall's size tried to tell her a lie about scale, that to fill it she must become more than she is. She let the lie pass. She gathered the air slow and low, the way she did in the kitchen while Daniel finished his homework, and let the first note rise not like a trick, but like morning. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. The sound carried with a clarity that rang against wood and glass and settled into bodies before minds could judge it. She chose a hymn she knew by muscle and heart, not because it was safe, but because it held the architecture of her courage. The line unfurled like soft ribbon, and in that instant the hall's argument dissolved. People stopped moving. Forked thoughts found a single road. Her second phrase revealed the thing Mr. Anderson had heard in the mansion, a resonance that didn't push but invited, a tone that felt like a hand placed gently on a shoulder you didn't know needed comfort. The orchestra sat inside its own listening, even the players unused to being silent this long, holding their breath so they wouldn't disturb the shape of the air. Maria did not decorate. She did not reach for applause with octave leaps or glittering runs. She turned vowels the way one turns light in a small room, gently so the edges reveal themselves without glare. Midway through, she let a rest hang a fraction longer than expected, and in that margin the audience felt the journey of her life without seeing any of it. Bronx radiators clicking at night, a mop bucket echoing in a stairwell, rent due on Friday, a boy at a window who thinks music is the safest place on earth. Richard felt something he didn't have a name for. His smirk, always available to him, got lost looking for its mark and never returned. Somewhere beneath the expensively tailored layers, the memory of his laughter in the mansion tried to organize itself into justification and failed. He looked at her face and failed to make it match the story of nobody he had told himself. It wasn't pity he felt, and it wasn't admiration, not yet. It was recognition that truth exists outside of price. He shifted in his seat and realized with an unfamiliar flush of heat that sitting still meant being confronted. Maria stepped into the final verse with the kind of Authority that doesn't draw attention to itself. Her decisions were simple and exact. Hold that note a hair beyond custom, soften the consonant there, let the line taper like a hand releasing another hand in goodbye. In the second row, a woman who had come for a night away from a difficult week found tears on her cheeks without warning. In the balcony, a young violinist visiting from a state school gripped the rail as if discovering a map he didn't know he needed. And in the wings, a stagehand who had worked the hall for 20 years, leaned against the fly rail and whispered, "Go on, kid." When the last note found its landing, she let it sit, not pinning it, not apologizing for it, just letting the silence that followed become part of the music. The impact arrived in the quiet, a room measuring itself against what it had almost missed. Then the applause rose, not the polite gratitude of donors, but the kind that starts in the center of the chest and insists on the hands. Mr. Anderson did not step forward to share it. He let it be hers. Maria bowed once, not deeply, with a grace that belonged to the woman who still sang by a kitchen window. She did not look for Richard. She did not need to. Backstage, the corridor carried the echo of clapping like rain along a roof. Maria reached the wings and stood still, as if movement might break the spell or turn the night back into the grind of before. A technician handed her a small bottle of water and said nothing, because some congratulations are better in the shape of quiet. Mr. Anderson joined her with a smile that looked relieved and proud at the same time. He didn't touch her shoulder or claim a share of the moment. He simply said, "You told the truth." She nodded, breath trembling into a laugh. "I didn't know if the truth would be enough." He answered, as if he'd been waiting years to say it to someone in exactly this hallway. "It always is when you don't rush it." Out in the audience, Richard stood slower than the people around him, clapping because not clapping would reveal too much about the structure he had built inside himself. He told his face to arrange itself into appreciation, yet the shape wouldn't hold, and something in his chest shifted, a recalibration he couldn't file under strategy. He remembered the sentence he had thrown like a stone, "This isn't a concert hall, it's a broom you're holding," and felt how small it sounded now. Behind his applause, a calculation he'd trusted for years began to misfire, and a quiet question slipped past his defenses. What if the thing I dismissed is the thing that matters? In the dressing room, the mirror returned a new version of the woman who had stared into it before the spotlight. Maria set the water bottle down and pressed both hands to the vanity as if steadying a bridge she had just crossed. "Daniel," she whispered to the empty room, closing her eyes. "We did it." It wasn't triumph that colored her voice. It was gratitude, clean, grounded, real. She could see his reaction already, the way he'd jump, the way he'd ask 100 urgent questions, the way he'd say, "See, I told you." She smiled and let herself feel the weight lift off her shoulders for one full breath, long enough to mark the moment as part of her journey rather than a dream she would wake from. Mr. Anderson watched her collect herself, then gestured toward the hallway that led back to the stage. "There's one more measure to play," he said softly, a conductor's metaphor standing in for the next practical step. "We'll keep it simple." She nodded, understanding that transformation rarely ends on the downbeat where the audience stops clapping. Out in the hall, the orchestra waited for the signal. The audience leaned into the possibility of an encore, and the night, carefully planned, precisely staged, realigned itself around a revelation no program note had promised. Richard remained on his feet, though not as quickly as the others. The ovation was thunderous, filling the hall with a sound he couldn't control, and for the first time in years he felt small in a room. Applause had always been a currency to him, something purchased, orchestrated, or carefully positioned. Tonight, it was different. The energy of the audience rose in waves not because of wealth or status, but because a woman he once dismissed as a nobody had opened her mouth and revealed a truth no chandelier or investment could compete with. He clapped because he had to, but The motion felt hollow, his palms striking together with none of the conviction he saw around him. Inside, something uncoiled that he didn't know how to name. It wasn't admiration exactly, nor was it envy. It was closer to recognition. The sting of knowing he had misjudged so badly that the very foundation of his judgment cracked under the weight of its own arrogance. He remembered his exact words in the mansion. "This isn't a concert hall, it's a broom you're holding." That sentence replayed now, like an ugly echo, dwarfed by the sound of the ovation, swallowed whole by her voice. Richard shifted in his seat, tugging at his cufflinks as if adjusting them could adjust his thoughts. He glanced around at the audience, faces lit with awe, tears streaking cheeks, hands red from clapping. These were the same people who toasted his business deals and praised his achievements at galas, yet tonight their loyalty wasn't with him. It was with her, the maid he had laughed at, the woman whose worth he had calculated as negligible. His smirk, always his shield, had vanished somewhere in the middle of her song and refused to return. Maria, still bathed in the soft glow of the spotlight, bowed again with a quiet grace that contrasted with the roaring applause. She didn't bow like someone hungry for approval. She bowed like someone acknowledging a gift she had been allowed to share. Behind her, the orchestra members leaned forward, nodding and smiling as though welcoming her into their circle. Some tapped their bows lightly against their stands in the kind of tribute reserved for colleagues they respected. That small gesture hit Richard harder than the ovation itself. It was a reminder that true communities, those built on passion and integrity, aren't bought, they are earned. The orchestra's acceptance of her, so effortless and genuine, made Richard feel exposed. He had spent his life cultivating appearances, convinced that influence was the ultimate measure of worth. Yet here, among the violins and cellos, Maria was being measured differently, by the honesty of her voice, the spirit in her tone, the transformation she evoked in the audience. He realized with a jolt that he could never purchase that kind of reverence. It wasn't for sale. In the back of his mind, he heard an old whisper from his father, a man whose approval had been a distant star Richard spent his life chasing. "Strength is control," his father used to say. "Never let anyone see your weakness." Richard had lived by that creed, turning it into empire and arrogance. But watching Maria, he saw that what moved people tonight wasn't control at all. It was vulnerability, raw, unpolished, sincere. A maid had done what he, with all his money and power, had never managed. She had opened a room not with fear, but with truth. He felt heat rising in his chest, not pride but shame. He saw himself as the crowd saw him now, though they weren't looking directly at him, a man who had laughed at a gift he couldn't understand. He wanted to shrink into the velvet seat, to become invisible the way he had demanded Maria be invisible in his home. His laughter that night replayed, louder than the applause now, and the contrast burned. "I was wrong," Richard whispered under his breath, words foreign on his tongue. No one around him heard, but for the first time the admission wasn't a performance or a strategy. It was an unavoidable truth pressing itself out of him. Maria stepped back from the microphone, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in front of her. The conductor placed a reassuring hand near her shoulder, not claiming the moment, but supporting it. She glanced out at the sea of faces and caught the tears on strangers' cheeks, the smiles of those who had never met her but felt connected through the honesty of her song. And in that vast audience, her gaze brushed briefly across Richard. She didn't hold it. She didn't need to. For her, this moment wasn't about him, but for Richard, it was about nothing else. That glance, brief as a shadow, carried a weight he couldn't bear. It wasn't anger or vengeance in her eyes. It was absence. She didn't see him. She didn't need him. And that, more than anything, revealed the hidden truth he had avoided his entire life. His money, his influence, his carefully constructed image could be dismissed in a heartbeat when confronted with real spirit. As the ovation thundered again, Richard sat down slowly, pressing his fingertips against his lips as though to keep the world from hearing his unsteady breath. Around him, people rose higher, shouting "Bravo!" and clapping until the hall shook. He remained seated for a moment, feeling the contrast between himself and everyone else in the room. Then, almost reluctantly, he stood, not because he wanted to, but because shame left him no choice. His hands came together once more, but this time the clapping wasn't for show. It was an admission, a confession disguised as applause. He knew in that moment he had been measured and found lacking, not by wealth or power, but by the simplest measure of all, spirit. The orchestra struck a final chord to close the set, the sound reverberating like a seal on what had just taken place. Maria bowed once more, then turned toward the wings, her figure disappearing into the shadows of the stage. Richard's eyes followed her, not with disdain, but with the hollow ache of a man confronted with what he had refused to see, that true worth is not purchased, not mocked, not erased. It lives unshaken in those who dare to reveal it. And as the audience continued to cheer, Richard's world, once so certain and carefully ordered, shifted under the weight of a truth he could no longer deny, leaving him face to face with the uncomfortable beginning of something he had never expected, a quiet reckoning. Backstage, the world narrowed to concrete floors, coiled cables, and the low thrum of applause fading like rain, receding down a long gutter. Maria stepped into the corridor, heart still beating in a rhythm the stage had taught it, and for a second she forgot where to put her hands. The light was ordinary here, no spotlight, just a tired bulb above a doorway, and the soft glow from exit signs. Then she saw him, Daniel, standing beside a stagehand with a visitor's pass crooked around his neck, sneakers untied, eyes bright with a belief that made everything else quiet. He didn't run. He held himself still, as if loud joy might break the moment. "Maria," he breathed, the word landing like a promise fulfilled. She opened her arms, and he stepped into them, small and solid, a center of gravity. "You sounded like home," he said into her shoulder. "You sounded like the nights when you sing by the window." She laughed through a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "I kept the window with me," she whispered. "I kept you." Mr. Anderson waited a respectful distance away, not wanting to intrude on the first embrace that matters. After a life-shaping moment, when their eyes met, he gave the kind of nod musicians share when words would only clatter. "There you are," he said, and his tone carried the warmth of a teacher seeing a student find the note they've reached for in the dark. Maria wiped a thumb under her eye, more reflex than need, and stepped toward him with Daniel's hand still in hers. "Thank you," she said, not as repayment, but as recognition. "You asked me to tell the truth." He tilted his head with a half smile. "And you did." The hall listened. He glanced down at Daniel. "You must be the brother." Daniel straightened, suddenly official. "I told her they needed to hear her," he said, daring the world to disagree. "You were right," the conductor answered, extending a hand. "Good ears often live in families before they live in concert halls." Behind-the-scenes traffic moved around them, the rustle of garment bags, the clipped cadence of a stage manager counting down the next cue, a violist, hurrying past with rosin dust on his sleeve. The ordinary pressed up against the extraordinary, and that collision revealed the hidden truth of transformation. It always happens in the middle of life, not apart from it. "I don't want to rush anything," Mr. Anderson went on, voice dropping to a practical register that steadied the air. "But opportunity has a tempo. If you want it, and only if you want it, we can arrange coaching, quiet rehearsals, no press, no spectacle. A few decisions will matter. We'll keep the space safe." Maria's fingers tightened gently around Daniel's. "I don't know what the path is," she admitted, honest enough to keep fear from turning into denial. "I haven't studied the way other people have." He nodded. "Technique can be taught. Spirit cannot. You showed spirit tonight. We'll build the rest slowly, in the right order." A member of the orchestra paused as she passed them and touched her heart with 2 fingers. A small salute that folded Maria into an unspoken circle. "Beautiful work," she said, not lingering long enough to make it a scene. Another nodded as he lifted his case. "See you in the rehearsal room," he murmured, as if it were a foregone conclusion. The impact of those gestures landed more deeply than flowers ever would. They weren't flattery, they were an invitation to belong. Maria turned to Daniel with a smile that held equal parts disbelief and acceptance. "They see me," she murmured. "I think they really see me." He squeezed her hand. "I always did." Out in the house, the ovation finally gave way to the soft chaos of intermission chatter. Richard remained where he was, not trapped, but certainly not free. The seat felt unfamiliar under him, as if the fabric had learned the weight of a different kind of audience and no longer adjusted to his. He watched people share reactions he couldn't purchase: astonishment, tenderness, the quiet awe that follows revelation. And in their reflections, he saw the outline of his own mindset breaking apart. It was not a dramatic shatter, it was a slow splintering, a realization that his decisions, dressed for years in confidence, had been carrying a blindness he mistook for discernment. He thought of the broom he'd used as a punchline, and the sentence returned, stripped of charm and left only with its cruelty. "What was I seeing?" he said under his breath. A sentence so unfamiliar to him that it sounded like someone else's voice. He stood and moved toward the aisle, not entirely sure where he was headed. Pride urged him toward the lobby, toward the safety of conversation that would let him narrate the evening with authority. Something softer pulled him in the opposite direction, toward the shadows at the side of the stage, where the curtain met the concrete wall. He chose the softness, not boldly, but honestly, which in this case felt braver. In a dim corner near the water cooler, he paused. Tex moved past without recognizing him, which might have been the first mercy of the night. For once, anonymity served him better than attention. He stood long enough to hear someone say, "She's still with the conductor," and for a heartbeat he considered turning back. Then he lowered his eyes, not to hide, but because he didn't deserve to look into a room he had tried to keep people from entering. When Maria finally stepped from the corridor into that narrow backstage lane, Daniel tugging gently at her sleeve, Richard found himself face to face with a choice. That did not care about his history. All the strategies that had always saved him, deflect, charm, escalate, felt like costumes in the wrong play. He started with her name, Maria. It was the first time he had said it without a tone that placed her below the sentence. She looked up, not startled but cautious, a boundary learned from experience. Daniel shifted closer to her side. Richard put both hands in view, as though proof he wasn't holding a weapon, and chose the only sentence that didn't insult the room. "I was wrong." The words were flat, a confession tied to no transaction. He didn't ask to be forgiven. He didn't dress it up as humility. He offered it as a fact. "I said something cruel because I could. I saw nothing where there was something." He searched for language that didn't belong to a press release and found it slowly. "You were extraordinary." Maria studied him with the patience of someone who has spent a life reading the fine print of people's intentions. "Thank you," she said, not coldly, not warmly, just precisely. "I don't need you to say it, but I hear you." Daniel looked from one to the other, sensing the shift but not its depth. Richard nodded once, grateful the exchange hadn't asked more than he could truthfully give. "I'll make sure your hours are covered this week," he added almost involuntarily, the instinct to fix with money twitching. Then he caught himself and shook his head. "That's not... I mean," he exhaled. "If you don't return, I'll understand. If you do, the house will be quieter." It was the closest he could come to repentance without pretending to a closeness they didn't share. He lowered his eyes again, both because arrogance felt empty and because lowering them made the next sentence possible. "I'm sorry." There were no cameras to capture it, no board members to credit him for contrition. The apology existed only where it needed to, between the person who had harmed and the person who had been harmed. Mr. Anderson watched from a few paces away, understanding that some decisions are private music. He didn't interject or orchestrate, he let the scene live. When Richard stepped back, unsure of what to do with his hands, the conductor moved into the space with a gentle efficiency. "We'll be in touch tomorrow," he said to Maria, returning to the practical as a way of protecting the fragile. "No rush on answers. We'll set times that work around your life. There are scholarships for coaching. We'll handle the logistics. The only non-negotiable is your rest. Voices like yours need silence as much as sound." Maria nodded, touched more by the respect in his planning than by the planning itself. "I can come mornings," she said quickly, mind leaping to subway schedules and Daniel's school hours. "And some evenings, if I can trade shifts." Anderson smiled. "Good. We'll map a path, not a fantasy, a path." They walked together down the corridor toward a side door that opened to a service alley. Cold air moved, in with a clean edge, cutting through the heat of adrenaline. Daniel bounced once on his toes, energy gathering with nowhere to go. "Does this mean she's in the orchestra now?" he asked, half whisper, half shout. Maria laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in weeks. "It means I get to learn," she said. "It means I get to try." He nodded as though trying is the most logical step toward destiny, which in the language of children is often the truest translation. The city met them with steam, rising from grates and a taxi horn lamenting its eternal fate. They walked to the corner under a streetlight that turned their breath visible. The transformation didn't announce itself with trumpets. It traveled in quieter signs, the looseness of Maria's shoulders, the way Daniel's questions spilled into the air like coins into a jar, the text from the wardrobe director promising to help her find a dress she could call her own next time. "Next time," Maria repeated under her breath, testing the shape of the future in her mouth. It didn't taste like arrogance. It tasted like responsibility. Back inside, Richard found himself lingering near the exit, unsure how to carry humiliation that had turned into instruction. The hall's walls, once merely expensive, now felt like they were holding an education he had refused. He walked toward the lobby, where a poster listed the season's programs, and paused, not to read, but to stand still enough to feel the building's pulse. A young couple hurried past, laughing through leftover tears, and one of them said, "I didn't know a voice could do that." Right there, the hidden truth landed. Some impacts live quietly inside people, rewriting their decisions tomorrow when no one's looking. He imagined a version of himself who could be changed by that kind of impact and made the smallest, most honest choice available. He would not speak about tonight as if he had arranged it. He would not fold it into his storyline. For once, he would let a moment belong to the person who created it. Maria and Daniel reached the subway stairs, the hum of the city braiding itself into their footsteps. On the platform, Daniel leaned against her side and asked, "What did it feel like?" She stared down the tunnel where the lights were still a rumor. "Like telling the truth louder than I've ever told it," she said. Like the room agreed the truth was enough. He nodded, satisfied. "It was enough," he said simply. "More than enough." She looked at him and saw the outline of every decision that would follow. Early trains, careful coaching, the tired joy of building technique, the quiet discipline of protecting a gift. The journey would be long, with days that felt like setbacks, with doubts that needed translating back into courage. But now the path was visible, not guaranteed, but visible. The train arrived with a rush of wind, and they stepped in, finding seats by a window scratched with initials. Maria rested her head against the cool glass and let the weight of the night settle into something she could carry without breaking. Mr. Anderson's message buzzed onto her phone a few minutes later. Times, addresses, a simple line at the end. "We'll go at your pace." She typed back, "Thank you," and added after an earned pause, "I'll be there." By the time they reached the Bronx, the air had softened. Daniel ran ahead to press the building's door and held it like a doorman in training. Inside the apartment, the radiator clicked the familiar rhythm of home, and Maria set the program down on the table like a leaf she wanted to keep between pages. She opened the window a crack, letting in a line of city noise, and hummed once, just to anchor the night to the room where it had started. "Sing it again," Daniel pleaded, collapsing onto the couch. She shook her head, smiling. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tonight, We breathe. He accepted the verdict with a dramatic sigh, then added, "You're going back, right?" She looked at him, the question already answered in his face. "I'm going forward," she said, and the sentence placed both feet where they belonged. Elsewhere, Richard walked the 2 blocks to where his driver waited and stopped half a car length early. He took off his gloves, felt the cold bite his fingers, and stood in it as a kind of necessary inventory. In the quiet of his own mind, he assembled what humility required, not a grand gesture, not a public statement, but a change in how he measured, a shift in what he applauded, a recalibration of where he looked for value. He didn't know yet what shape that would take at home, in business, or in the rooms he controlled, but he knew the first move. Listen, start there, he told himself, words that sounded strange and right together. He reached for the car door, paused, and looked back at the hall, its glass catching a last reflection of the night. For the first time, he recognized a place he could not buy his way into, not the building, but the moment inside it, where spirit outranked wealth. The lesson did not arrive as a moral stamped in gold leaf, it came as a lived shift. Maria had shown that humility doesn't ask permission to reveal value, it simply reveals it, and the room either learns or it doesn't. Tonight, the room learned. The conductor offered not a ladder but a path, one step at a time. The brother held the lamp of belief against the dark, and the man who mocked lowered his eyes, confronted by the emptiness of arrogance and the possibility, still fragile, of better choices. Sleep would come later, carrying new questions. Papers would be signed or not, schedules rearranged. A voice warmed each morning beside a window that looked out on a city that had not changed and yet felt different. And somewhere between a rehearsal room and a kitchen table, the next measure waited, already written in the quiet space where courage becomes routine. And maybe now, after walking through this story together, you feel that same quiet shift Maria felt when she realized her voice mattered. If something in this journey touched you, let me know down in the comments. Just write, "I'm with you until the end," or "This message was for me." I'll know you carried the story all the way through. And if you found meaning here, a simple like helps me keep bringing you these kinds of stories. Each one a reminder that behind every surface there's a hidden truth waiting to be heard. Subscribing is the way to stay close, so the next time we open a door into a world of contrast, resilience, and transformation, you'll be right here with me. And since stories never really end, there's another waiting for you now. There's a video right here that complements this one. Click and continue with me there. Let's keep walking together.